There's a certain kind of person who handles a crisis better than almost anyone in the room, who stays calm when things fall apart, who figures out what needs to be done and does it without announcing it, who somehow already anticipated the problem before it fully arrived. And then, when it's over, when the dust settles and people start talking about what happened and how they feel about it, that same person quietly steps back. Not because they don't have feelings about it, but because talking about feelings in real time, in public, with an audience, that has never felt like the point. The point was solving it. The point was getting through it. The feelings can wait, or they can stay private, or they can dissolve on their own the way feelings do when you've had enough practice letting them. If you recognize yourself in that description, you probably also recognize the slight friction it creates in a world that increasingly wants you to process everything out loud, share everything publicly, and perform your inner life for an audience you never asked for. You've been told, at various points in your life, that you're too closed off, too self-sufficient to a fault, too cynical, too detached, that you have walls, that you need to open up more, trust more, lean on people more, be more vulnerable in the ways that other people seem to find natural. And the part that has always felt quietly wrong about all of that is this: you're not closed off because something went wrong with you. You're not cynical because you failed to stay optimistic. You don't have walls because you're afraid of people. You have walls because you built them deliberately, carefully, and for very good reasons. Reasons that made complete sense given the specific world you grew up in. The world just forgot to update its assessment of you when the circumstances changed. What we're actually talking about is a generation that has been sitting in the middle of every cultural conversation for decades. Mentioned less, analyzed less, understood less, than almost any other group of people alive right now. Generation X. Born somewhere between 1965 and 1980. Old enough to remember a world before the internet as a lived daily reality. Young enough to have built and adapted to it with more fluency than the generation before them. And psychologically, almost certainly the most misunderstood generation of the modern era. Not because their experience was the most dramatic, but because the particular way it shaped them is so easy to misread from the outside. Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface, and why it makes complete sense. The psychological architecture of Generation X was built in conditions that no parenting book had ever fully addressed, because the conditions themselves were historically new. The divorce rate in the United States roughly doubled between 1960 and 1980. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers throughout the 1970s. The economy demanded two incomes from families that had previously been structured around one. And the infrastructure to support what that shift meant for children, affordable childcare, supervised after-school programs, the social scaffolding that would have caught the gap, simply wasn't there yet. What was there, in millions of homes across the country, was an empty house. A key on a string around a child's neck. A note on the counter and a phone number for emergencies. A study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry found that by 1984 approximately 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. 7 million children learning, in the most concrete and unrepeatable way, that the world does not always have someone in it who is coming to make sure you're okay. That sometimes you are the person responsible for yourself. That figuring it out alone is not a last resort, it is simply what you do. What that does to a developing nervous system is not a small thing, and it does not produce the same outcome in every child, but it produces a recognizable pattern. The brain that learns early that external support is unreliable does not become hopeless. It becomes resourceful. It shifts its investment, away from the assumption that help will arrive, and toward the development of internal competence so thorough and so practiced that needing help starts to feel like an unnecessary variable. Researchers who study early independence and its long-term effects describe what emerges as a particular kind of cognitive confidence, a belief, installed before adolescence, that problems are solvable through effort and that the self is the most reliable tool available for solving them. This is not the same as not needing people. It is not the same as not wanting connection. It is a specific adaptation of a developing nervous system to a specific environment, and the adaptation was intelligent. It was appropriate. It was, in the truest sense of the word, the right response to the world that was actually there. The world that was actually there also included, for much of this generation's childhood and adolescence, a parade of institutional failures significant enough to make adult authority feel not just fallible but structurally untrustworthy. Watergate broke before many of them were old enough to fully understand it and completed its arc as they were just beginning to develop political consciousness. The fumbled public health response to the AIDS crisis unfolded in real time through their teenage years. Corporate America, which had promised their parents stability and security in exchange for loyalty and decades of service, revealed itself as willing to discard those same parents through rounds of layoffs with a coldness that left no room for the story it had been telling. The institutions that were supposed to be trustworthy demonstrated, repeatedly and in public, that they were not. The psychological result of this is what researchers sometimes call dispositional skepticism, not depression, not nihilism, but a calibrated reluctance to extend full trust to systems, institutions, or authority figures based solely on their position or their stated intentions. Developmental psychologist Judith Rich Harris documented extensively how peer environments and broader cultural context shape personality formation as significantly as parenting. For Generation X, the broader cultural context was a sustained lesson in the gap between what authority figures said and what they actually did. The response, holding institutions at arm's length, maintaining independent judgment, respecting competence rather than title, was not cynicism. It was pattern recognition. It was the nervous system encoding what the evidence actually showed, rather than what it was told to believe. There is also the matter of what they watched happen to the adults they grew up around, and what that watching installed in them about the relationship between effort, loyalty, and outcome. They saw people give decades to companies that eliminated their positions without ceremony. They saw marriages built on the assumption of permanence dissolve at rates that made the assumption itself feel naive. They saw people who followed every rule, did everything right, and still found themselves on the wrong side of circumstances they had no control over. The lesson available from all of this, the one the nervous system draws when the evidence is consistent and repeated, is that outcomes are not reliably proportional to effort, that security is not a permanent state, and that the only thing you can genuinely control is the quality and range of your own capabilities. Psychologists call the resulting orientation defensive pessimism, a cognitive strategy in which a person deliberately anticipates negative outcomes not because they've given up hope, but because mentally preparing for the worst is how they manage the anxiety of not being able to fully trust the best. Research by psychologist Julie Norham at Wellesley College has documented how defensive pessimism, when deployed skillfully, actually improves performance, because the person using it has already worked through the failure scenarios and prepared contingencies that people with more optimistic orientations haven't considered. What looks from the outside like a tendency to expect the worst is, from the inside, a sophisticated anxiety management and preparation strategy. The glass half empty framing is not a mood. It is a tool. Now follow this forward into adulthood, into careers, into relationships, into the particular way a person shaped by all of this moves through the world, and something interesting becomes visible. The same orientation that makes someone fiercely self-reliant also makes them quietly, consistently reliable to the people they choose to be close to. Because the bonds that form when external structure is absent, when children are building their social worlds largely without adult architecture, in basements and vacant lots and unsupervised afternoons, those bonds are made from different material than the bonds formed inside organized, supervised, structured childhood environments. They're built from genuine mutual dependence, from real stakes, from the kind of trust that develops not because an institution arranged it but because two people decided, without any external framework, that they could count on each other. This is the paradox that lives at the center of Generation X psychology and almost never gets named accurately. The most self-reliant generation is also, in the specific context of chosen relationships, among the most genuinely loyal. Not performatively loyal. Not loyal in the way that involves public declarations and documented demonstrations. Quietly, practically, functionally loyal. The kind of loyalty that shows up without announcement when something actually needs doing, and then leaves without requiring acknowledgement that it was there. The same is true at work, and it's worth examining closely because it's easy to misread. Generation X workers are not motivated by the metrics that motivate the generations on either side of them. They are not driven by public recognition, by title progression for its own sake, by the social architecture of workplace culture. They are driven by something more private and more durable, the knowledge that they are genuinely good at what they do. Competence, for this generation, is not a means to external reward. It is an end in itself, because competence is the one thing the world has consistently demonstrated cannot be taken away by a layoff, a market correction, an institutional failure, or a rug pull. You can lose your job. You cannot lose what you actually know how to do. Here is the counterintuitive layer. Everything that makes Generation X difficult to market to, difficult to manage with conventional incentive structures, difficult to impress with titles and perks and public recognition. All of that is the same thing that makes them extraordinarily stable under conditions that destabilize almost everyone else. They were trained for instability. They were built, by specific and repeated developmental experience, to function without external scaffolding. When the scaffolding falls, and in any organization, in any economy, in any life, it eventually falls, the person who was never dependent on it is the person who keeps moving. The quiet irony of Generation X's place in cultural history is this. They are the generation that built the infrastructure that every subsequent generation now lives inside, and they did it without expecting credit for it, and they mostly didn't get any. They were the engineers and the coders and the entrepreneurs who created the digital world before anyone understood what the digital world was going to become. They did this with the same orientation they brought to everything, methodically, independently, without waiting for permission or external validation, because waiting for permission was never how anything got done in the world they grew up in. And now they watch a culture that is saturated with visibility, performance, public self-disclosure, and the constant documentation of inner life. And they feel, if they're honest about it, a particular kind of alienation that doesn't have a clean name. Not superiority. Not contempt. Something quieter and more complicated than that. Something like watching a game being played by rules they were never taught and don't entirely trust, in a stadium they helped build, for an audience they were never oriented toward performing for. They are not broken. They never were. The armor is real and the armor was earned and the armor has served them through things that would have undone people built differently. The detachment is not emptiness, it is space. Space that was created deliberately, maintained carefully, and used to think clearly in situations where other people's thinking was clouded by the emotional noise of being too exposed. The humor is not deflection, or it is deflection, but deflection as a sophisticated and functional tool for managing a world that was often absurd and sometimes genuinely dangerous and almost always unwilling to acknowledge either of those things directly. They learned to hold two contradictory things at once because the world they grew up in was full of contradictions that no one resolved. They learned to be independent because independence was not a virtue instilled by philosophy, it was a daily practical necessity installed by circumstance. They learned to distrust what couldn't be demonstrated because they watched demonstrated trustworthiness fail repeatedly and wanted no part of the alternative. All of that is still in them. All of it is still working. And none of it needs to be fixed. Not the self-reliance that borders on stubbornness, not the skepticism that can read as cynicism, not the privacy that can read as coldness, not the quiet competence that can read as arrogance in a culture that confuses visibility with value. None of it is the wrong response. It was always the accurate response to the specific world that was actually there. The specific world has changed. The responses haven't fully updated, because responses built that deep and that early don't update quickly. That's not a failure of adaptability. That's just how nervous systems work when the learning happened at the right depth during the right window. The architecture is load-bearing. It doesn't just dissolve because the building is standing on different ground now. What changes, slowly and without drama, because nothing in Generation X psychology happens with drama if it can possibly be avoided, is the awareness. The recognition that the armor that was necessary then is sometimes heavier than the current weather requires. That the self-reliance that kept them safe can occasionally be set down in the presence of people who have earned the right to hold something. That the skepticism that protected them from institutional betrayal doesn't have to apply at full strength to every human interaction in a room. That awareness doesn't require changing who they are. It just requires seeing it clearly, the whole picture, the whole history, the whole logic of how a person becomes who they are through the specific pressure of the specific world they were given. And that logic, once you see it fully, is not tragic. It's actually quite remarkable. If something in this felt less like information and more like recognition, like someone finally described something accurately that you've been carrying without a name for a long time, that's not an accident. There's more underneath this. A whole architecture of how the world you grew up in shaped the way you think, the way you connect, the way you handle uncertainty, and the way you understand what it means to be reliable in an unreliable world. Most of it has never been said out loud in a way that felt true. There's more here, if you want to keep going. Subscribe for more content and we will see you in the next one.